Welcome to the fourth lecture for HIH2001, the study trip to Torren and Malberg, examining life in medieval Prussia. This lecture is about the Hansiatic League. The Hansiatic League, or the Hansa for short, was probably the most prominent, certainly in Northern Europe, the most prominent trading association to emerge in the course of the later Middle Ages. Now I'm going to start out by framing up the shape of the medieval economy in the later Middle Ages in particular. By the time we get on to the 13th and 14th century and beyond, we have four major urban economic areas. Now the first is Italy and the Mediterranean. The Italian city-states like Genoa, Florence, Venice, for example, they specialize in particular in moving high-value relatively high value per kilo, high value per volume specialty goods from the Near East and beyond through their bases in the Italian peninsula and delivering them to the rest of Europe. Now this comprises things such as spices, silks, generally goods which can't be produced or can't be produced well or cheaply in Europe. So that's quite a particular niche. They do expand into some other things, some wool trade and so forth, but the real money spinners are moving goods into Europe that can't be produced there. Now, Northern Europe is a second focus of urban economic activity, but it's very different. It's focused on the Low Countries and Westphalia in the Holy Roman Empire. Again, keep in mind that the Holy Roman Empire is the name for Germany in the Middle Ages. And the economy, particularly in Low Countries, is based around bringing in raw materials, wool and flax, and turning wool specifically into very good high-quality cloth, which is then exported back out to the same countries that provided those raw materials. England in the late Middle Ages is a big producer of wool. Wool is shipped to the Low Countries in bulk. That wool is turned into finished cloth and it's sold back to places in the British Isles. For example, trade in the neighboring Westphalia region of the Holy Roman Empire was more based on the exchange of cloth and finished materials from the Low Countries and beyond for raw materials coming in from the east, from the Baltic zone. And we'll focus on the development of that trade in particular throughout the rest of this lecture. The third area of urban economic expansion in the Middle Ages was Spain and England. This is the so-called raw materials producing periphery. Spain and England, for example, both produce a lot of wool, which is turned into cloth in more urbanized areas like Low Countries and sent back out. But the same process of raw materials coming from England, Spain, and similar places such as Poland into more urbanized zones, and then finished goods going back out is a prominent feature of the late medieval urban economy. Lastly, we get what we might call colonial regions, east and west, and this I would say includes Wales and Ireland, certainly Prussia and Livonia to a large extent, and these are places where an urban network is created very much as a result of outside influence quite rapidly in the course of the 13th century. And you see a kind of emergent network of towns. In Wales and Ireland, these colonial regions effectively end up feeding, collecting raw materials and feeding them into the broader English trade network. And in the east, in Prussia, for example, we see raw materials collected in and shipped to the cities of Westphalia in particular, where they're turned into finished products and traded on. So just an outline there, four main economic areas: Italy and the Mediterranean, then industrialized Northern Europe, industrialized in the sense they're producing cloth and things in large quantities, not mechanized industry. Third, the kind of raw materials periphery like England and Spain, relatively large established kingdoms that are not doing much to produce finished goods, but churning out lots of raw materials. And then finally, these colonial regions. I'll add a note here. It's just worth keeping in mind as we go on that medieval urban life is quite difficult to maintain, actually. And one key reason for that is that we have very high mortality in urban areas. Infant mortality in towns is perhaps as high as 1 in 3. And so you need constant in-migration into towns and cities to keep them going. Now, if we look at urban Northern Europe, here I'm going to focus on this kind of low countries in Westphalia, Germanic area. This is that kind of urbanized proto-industrial or early industrial heartland in Northern Europe. Urban contraction and stagnation happens in these areas around about 500 to 1000, particularly in places west of the Rhine, which had been within the Roman Empire. There's a kind of urban collapse through what used to be called the Dark Ages, that period up to about 1000. But the big story here in Northern Europe is a combination of recovery after the year 1100 in particular, and also the creation of new towns in areas that were beyond the fringe of the Roman Empire. In the Low Countries by 1300, Ghent is 65,000, Bruges maybe 10 to 25,000, and there are more cities, a good number more cities like these spread throughout Westphalia and Low Countries. And despite the fact that plague visits this part of Europe in 1348 to 49, as it does everywhere else, and despite the fact that we see maybe 30 to 40% plague mortality, these areas recover pretty quickly, and by 1450, 100 years after the plague, Ghent is back to a population of maybe 50,000, and Bruges has surged to perhaps 200,000. Again, similar with other cities and region. If we look at the Holy Roman Empire, again, this is what we now call Germany, and we're focusing here mostly on Westphalia, the kind of industrialized western heartland of modern Germany. We see by the year 1300, Frankfurt, Augsburg, Breslau, Ulm, Lübeck, Danzig. We'll come back to Gdansk, to Danzig in a bit. Nuremberg, Strasbourg, Hamburg, Bremen, Rostock. They all have 10 to 25,000. Now, a lot of these are cities right out at the fringe of what had been Romanized back during the age of the Roman Empire. And these cities, like those in the Low Country, suffer population loss and a certain degree of stagnation during the Black Death, but urban life proves resilient and carries on. The cities are dominated by, in many cases, right from their inception, by a king or the Holy Roman Emperor or a local magnate in this part of the world. Often these kind of prince bishops that you get controlling parts of the Holy Roman Emperor, for example, like Worms. Germanic and Frankish kings begin to more frequently grant charters of town liberties. These are special privileges given to urban communities, granting them low taxes, freedom from tolls on moving goods in and out of the city, and so forth. They begin to do that more frequently in step with population growth after the year 1100. And I'll just give you a little bit of an aside here about population growth. Something rather remarkable happens across Europe in the course of the 12th and 13th centuries. It's thought that typically population increased by at least as much as 100%, and in some parts of Europe as much as 200% between the years roughly 1100 and 1300. For example, in England, we imagine the population to have been about 2 million in the year 1100, but by the year 1300 we think the English population had hit about 6 million, i.e. a 200% increase, or in other words, a trebling of the population. Now that kind of radical population increase is a common trend across Europe, and in part the growth of these towns is fueled by people from a rapidly more crowded, increasingly crowded countryside moving into urban environments for work. Now, in step with that, as the towns grow, swelled by people moving from an overcrowded countryside into the city, we see the granting of charters. I give you at the bottom here some of the more important of the rights granted in town charters. They're given a degree of self-government. Typically this results in a kind of town council and a town court for handling minor criminal affairs. Most towns are granted freedom from imperial or royal taxes, freedom to regulate trade within the city, and this is quite important because it allows them to have control over different groups of merchants. Town officials can have control over different groups of merchants in different trades and ensure various quality standards and procedures and so forth. And towns are typically given a trade monopoly over a surrounding district. So, for example, no other markets are to be founded in competition with the city within 10 miles or 15 miles or 20 miles. The size of that surrounding district where no other markets may be held is quite variable depending on where you're at. In terms of industry and trade, what do we mean by industry in this period? When we refer to, for example, the Low Countries from Ghent to Utrecht as the, quote, first industrialized zone in European history, what do we mean by that? Well, we don't mean kind of steam engines and foundries churning away, but we do mean the concept of workshops where people get up in the morning, they go to a place, they carry out a sort of craft work job and systematically produce the same product day in and day out. As I have already mentioned, there's rapid population growth between 1000 and 1300, and where there are land shortages, most acute in the Low Countries, the people who can't get hold of land, or those who can't get hold of enough land to support themselves decant off to these cities. And in the Low Countries, it's the cloth industry more than anything else that underpins urban growth there. Capitalizing on this surplus population, large workshops, they say, are set up in which people go in and spin thread all day long. They go in and they weave cloth all day long. Or they go into a workshop and they fold cloth, which is to say the process of taking woolen cloth and softening it. Or they shear or stretch or any other of a number of tasks associated with the early cloth industry. By 1250, Ghent had emerged as a European center of the cloth industry, and other cities such as Bruges follow. Of course, people living in these cities have to be fed, and since their own hinterlands can't feed them, they need to be able to take these products and sell them to other areas, more food-producing rural areas, for enough money or grain in exchange to keep the city going. And so this creates this kind of huge engine of cloth production in the Low Countries. It buys in wool from further and further afield to keep fueling those workshops. They buy wool from relatively close, relatively near areas in France initially, but very quickly they move on to buying wool from Britain, from England, from Wales, from Scotland, even from Ireland, from Spain, of course, even Italy to a certain extent. And then they produce not just cloth, but a wide variety of very specialized kinds of cloth. For example, Brabant cloth, which is named after the city, of course, or there's a great sensitivity in the Middle Ages to different kinds of cloth, of just what the weave is, just what the color of the dye is, and so forth. Something which we've more or less lost a sensitivity for today. But of course, the industry in the Low Countries is only half the equation of Northern Europe becoming more urbanized. The other half of the equation is the rise of the Hansa, which works very hard to ship out the finished goods of the Low Countries and from further afield and exchange them for other things which people want or need in Northern and Western Europe. So I give you a slide here on the so-called rise of the Hansa, the rise of the Hanseatic League. Now, Frankish and Germanic cities in Northern Europe began to enter into commercial agreements with one another for mutual gain. So once you have a charter granted to a settlement, it grows into a city with a high degree of self-governance. It can then say, okay, let's look around for other similar urban communities and see if we can't strike up a trade deal. This is a bit like the way in which nations negotiate trade deals today. Now, these trading leagues develop a very particular sense of self-identity. And the most successful trading league comprised of cities is this Hanseatic League, which more than just being some cities with bilateral trade agreements, develops something that looks like a government that has an assembly called a Diet. It issues laws and regulations that should apply to all cities in the league, and of course that assembly, the so-called Diet, is populated by representatives chosen from the population of the various cities in the league. In a way, one hesitates to say something like an early, EEC, European Economic Area, but in a sense, that's kind of what's going on here at an early stage. The most successful league, the Hansa, springs initially from a trade agreement entered into by the merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg in 1241. Lübeck controlled cloth and wine moving east along Northern Europe from the Low Countries and France, as well as North Sea fishing supplies. Hamburg, on the other hand, controlled supplies of salt, pitch, furs, timber, flax, and other items moving west out of the Baltic. And so you can see where these cities see it to their mutual benefit to try and grease the wheels of trade by working together, because they're not in much danger of stepping on each other's toes. But once the economic agreement between Hamburg and Lübeck gets off the ground, other cities rapidly joined the league. For example, Cologne joined in 1260. So the Hansa towns, once they formed up into something that looks rather like a government, and they're making rules that govern what all of the cities signed up to the Hansa are doing collectively, they then begin to negotiate legal rights with other nations. I should be careful there, legal rights with nations. Because, of course, the Hansa towns themselves spanned both the state, the Teutonic Knights, as we'll come back to in a moment, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Hansa negotiated rights, for example, with Henry III of England in 1266 to set up a warehouse depot in London to help them in shifting goods back and forth between east and west and to points further on. They also operate out of Hull, Boston, Lynn, Yarmouth, and Ipswich, and that's just in England. And so they're really savvy, not only looking after themselves, but negotiating with other states agreements to set up depots that allow them to move goods from point A to point B in a series of stages instead of having to sail all the way from one end of the journey to the other in one go. Now, the Hansa even wages wars, and they come apart a little bit in the 14th century because they get into a squabble with the King of Denmark in particular. Now, the Hanseatic cities, of course, have lots of ships, but they don't want to get their hands dirty themselves, and so they hire mercenaries principally. And how things unfold with the King of Denmark are very telling. of course, the Hansa between Hamburg and Lübeck, they have a capacity to offload goods on the eastern side of the Danish peninsula, effectively move them overland with the assistance of water to the west side of the Danish peninsula, and then to ship them further by sea. This allows them to kind of bypass the so-called Skagerrak and Danish Straits that separate Denmark from Sweden. So it allows them to kind of slip past the Danes without paying any taxes. Now, from 1361 to 1370, the Hansiatic League, whose cities are in both the state of the Teutonic Knights and back in the Holy Roman Empire, they managed to wage a mercenary war against the King of Denmark, whilst not dragging either the state of the Order or the Holy Roman Empire directly into the conflict. So it's kind of interesting that you can have an organization that spans states, effectively a non-state organization at war with the state. But this is a kind of a no-win situation, really, whereby basically the Hanseatic League just saps its own resources, and whilst they may, in a sense, come out on top insofar as they keep their hegemony over. Now, what I show you here is now a very old map, published in the early part of the 20th century, but it's still a good piece of research here. This is the area in which the Hanseatic League operated, and what you'll see here are cities associated with the League in areas that are colored in the various colors, and also outside of the colored areas you'll see certain cities with a red line under the name. For example, if you look at the left of the map, nearby, fire up the pointer here, there we are, you'll see here London, Ipswich, Yarmouth. These cities with a red line under the name are cities where the Hansa had warehousing rights and kept goods in transit. Now, even by modern standards, this is a vast area. So you'll see, if you look at the scale of miles up here at the top, 150 miles you'll see here is, well, I'm trying to think of a relative basis on a standard computer screen, but is that a little over an inch or something? But you can see here that these are hundreds and hundreds of miles from the extreme east end, where they have warehousing in Novgorod, the Republic of Novgorod in what's now Russia, and the extreme west end here, where they have warehousing in London. And it's this roughly east-west or northeast to southwest axis here between London and Novgorod on which they operate. Hanseatic towns that are now in modern Poland include the old Prussian towns of Cholm or Chelmno, Thorn or Torun, and I give you here the German names on the left and the modern Polish names in the east. Of course, the oldest of these is Torun, which was founded in 1231, with a new town founded in 1264. It's a member of the Hanseatic League from at least 1280, and so the League is it's decades old by then, but it's only really just coming into its coming to the fore as an expanding trading force at this time. Torun is the biggest port for seafaring vessels on the River Vistula, River Wisła in Polish. The Wisła, of course, empties out into the Baltic, where the city of Gdansk is now. But it's a broad, relatively deep water river, and if you follow it upstream, Torun's about as far as you can go before you start beaching your vessel on sandbars and so forth. And so it's an important point of exchange. Grain comes from the heart of Poland up the Vistula, from as far south as Krakow, up to Torun, where it could be offloaded onto from small vessels onto larger seagoing vessels, which could then carry it out via the Baltic. Or goods of all kinds could be offloaded to seafaring vessels and brought from the interior and loaded onto them at Torun. That's a really important function, because that gives it a very large interior hinterland. And this trade shapes the city, particularly in the 13th, and as trade really takes off in the 14th century. Other towns which have membership in the Hansiatic League in the late Middle Ages, I'll give you here the German names as they would have been the contemporary ones: Bronsberg, Elbing, Danzig, Marienburg, and Memel. In particular, these are the so-called big towns of the Hansiatic League, were so-called big towns of Prussia, and they're all members of the Hansiatic League. So here we can cast an eye over Torun, where we're going to study trip, of course. You'll see on this slide on the bottom right an aerial view, and on the top left, what are the free tourist maps that you'll get in Torun. At the top, you'll see the river Wisła, Vistula. If you look at the right here, you'll see outlined in blue, this is the so-called old town of Torun, founded in 1231. And in 1264, you have the foundation of this so-called new town, outlined in red. And what's going on there is the Teutonic Knights who have a castle, and I'll circle it now with the pointer, just here on the river, or in this map on the left, you can see the castle in bright green. They decide that they're going to found this town at an early stage, to support their military outposts, to stimulate trade from which they could raise money. And because it's set in a finite area of land, they realize that actually there's a market there for, well, figuratively, there's literally a market for goods, but there's also a kind of market for, or appetite maybe is a better word, for town life and town burger status. And they realize that actually if they found this second settlement immediately next to the first, that actually it will populate with people as well who will equally pay taxes and happily have their own market, and they can effectively double dip, as we would say, and earn tax revenue from both urban communities. And so even though these are physically next to each other, administratively, legally, the old town and new town of Torun are completely separate entities. You can see, for example, the market square of Old Torun here on the right, and the market square of New Torun, a little bit hard to see, but just here on the left. There are a series of technological advances that help make this expansion into the east of seaborne trade possible. But maybe the most important, certainly in the 13th century, is the cog. The word cog refers to a certain kind of ship, as you see here, a vessel which is not speedy, but it's fairly broad and sturdy, overlapping timbers, and it can take a pounding basically in the rough seas of the Baltic. On the top left here, you see the so-called Bremen cog. This is a wreck that was discovered in the river at Bremen, sank into the mud. In a way, it's similar in the way it was preserved to the so-called Newport ship, which was found in Newport, South Wales a few years ago, where part of that hull was also preserved in mud that was so heavy it blocked blocked the usual small creatures which eat the wood and deteriorate it from surviving and digesting the wood. On the top right, you'll see a reconstruction of the Bremen cog here. You'll see that this sort of castle, as it's called, this elevated bit in the back. you'll see a contemporary medieval illustration of a cog down here at the bottom of the screen with a little so-called forecastle here, where a defender could be in the front versus some men, archers, defending the ship back here at the rear. This is not a tremendously large vessel. I like that this automobile is just here in the pictures. You can get a sense of the relative size of the vessel. They're not extraordinarily large, but then again, they're large enough to make a long-distance travel profitable whilst being of shallow enough draught to head pretty far upriver. You know, Torren itself is a very long way inland. I mean, to put it in perspective for you, a modern automobile on a more or less straight road takes well over an hour at high speed to get from Torren up to the coast. So imagine on a wiggly river how many miles upriver you are there. The cog is invented, as it were, or something that looks like a cog. To us, seems to be in use in the late 10th century. It's high. It's got a high prow for defense, sturdy construction, clinker built and double clinched. Clinchers are the so-called nails you kind of drive through and bend over to hold boards together. It's got a single mast and a square rigged sail, so when the wind's going with it, it can move with the wind. And it could be rowed or punted even. Punted is the process of sticking very long poles over the side of the ship and pushing it along. So it's quite versatile, basic but sturdy and versatile. It's just some images of the type of goods that were coming out of the Baltic on these cogs. This is some flax down here in the bottom right, but you've got some pine pitch here, which is used for waterproofing things. You have furs down here in the bottom left, a very high value luxury good. Here you have some amber made into quite a remarkable, this looks like a reliquary here. I see a little Christ figure at the top. But amber, of course, is fossilized tree resin. Now, the cities like Torren get rich off of the tax revenue that this trade creates. Burgesses pay taxes to the state Teutonic order for the right to hold their burgage property. The knights and the city authorities, to a certain extent, tax goods traded in the marketplace. They tax goods when they come in and out of the city gates, and they also tax goods at the quaysides. These are two gates at the bottom here along the River Vistula. Here's a so-called Sailor's Gate, where they could control the flow of people coming off of ships in and out of the city. And on the left here is a so-called Holy Spirit, which led down to the quayside. And just around up here, here's a lovely image of Torren on the north bank of the River Vistula, as viewed from the south bank, that is to say, the Polish side of the river. In the Middle Ages, this on the north was the state Teutonic Knights, and in the foreground was the Kingdom of Poland. And you can just see here how imposing the city looked. Here's the Holy Spirit Gate. You can see the medieval town wall stretching along the river, and it's really, even by modern standards, quite an extensive wall. Here's a gate here, and finally another gate down here. You can get a sense, and this is just the exterior wall of the new, or excuse me, just the exterior wall of the old medieval town. And this is a cathedral in the center here. Thank you for listening.